Hey there, Nick Gentakas here. In this video, we're going to go over a Flask extension that I recently open sourced called Flask-DB, and it'll help you migrate and manage your SQL databases, specifically if you're using SQL Alchemy. Chances are if you're using Flask along with Postgres or MySQL, then you are using SQL Alchemy because it's one of the most popular database ORMs in Python. Also, if you're familiar with SQL Alchemy, you're probably very aware of tools like Alembic or Flask-Migrate. Alembic is the official database migration tool for SQL Alchemy. It's created and maintained by the same team who creates SQL Alchemy. Really, you shouldn't be using anything besides Alembic for managing your migrations. And just a heads up, this tool, along with Flask-Migrate, by the way, both use Alembic under the hood. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. When it comes to the differences between Flask-Migrate and Flask-DB for the migrations, well, there's some implementation details that are different. I don't want to get into that now. Maybe we'll get into that later. It's not really important. But just understand that Flask-DB is not trying to do anything crazy with migrations, right? The tried and true Alembic tool is being used here. It's basically just aliases.cli and generates some opinionated configs for it. But this tool does quite a bit more than just database migrations. For example, you can reset your database and create test databases or things like that. And it also deals with creating seed data. So I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this stuff because it's way better just to show. But I figured we would install this tool into a Flask project so you can see how it works. But seeding essentially, the TLDR is, let's say that you're deploying your app for the very first time in production and you initialize a brand new database. So this database right now has absolutely nothing in it, right? So you could seed your database with something maybe, I don't know, it depends on what your app does, but initializing the first admin user of the system, just by putting in something like your email credentials and password through environment variables or whatever, that would be a good way to set up an initial user on your system. So you don't need to open up a pSQL prompt and then manually create a record in your database like that. So this tool will handle all of that by exposing a Flask-DB seed command. But let's get rolling with this one. So installation is actually very easy here. All you have to do is pip install Flask-DB and you're done. You don't even need to add an initializer in your Flask app factory or anything like that. So I figured, let's just do this together here. I have an example Flask app here that I'm going to add. This is from my Build a SaaS App with Flask course, but this has no bearing. You'll be able to add this into your own app as well. So if you don't have the course, that's totally fine. So the only thing I did here in my requirements.txt file is I added Flask-DB 0.20 because it's a good idea, right, to lock your dependencies to a specific patch release. But there we go. I added that to the file. And, in this case, it's a Dockerized application. So off camera, I've run a Docker Compose build. Well, technically, I guess this should finish very fast because, all the dependencies are already installed. So Docker is going to have them all cached. But, you would do your typical pip install in your requirements file, right? Standard like any other Python library. And now I'm just going to start my project up. And again, depending on how you have your application set up, you may or may not be using Docker. That's not too important. But as this spins up, all these containers are being created in the background, like a Unicorn web server, a Celery web worker, Webpack, and also Postgres, the database. So actually, you know what? Let me split this the other way so it's a little bit easier to read. So now if I run a docker exec web Flask, by the way, you'll just be running Flask, right, if you're not using Docker, then you're going to notice that there's a new DB command that you can run. You can ignore all these other ones. These are specific to the course and other extensions that I've written. But the DB one is the one that we care about. So let's run a web Flask-DB here. And we can see that we have a couple of commands that we can run. We can basically run the init command, which is very similar to Alembic init, if you've ever used that in the past. But the config files being generated by this extension have a little bit more opinions, and I don't know, they're just dried up a bit more to basically handle connections to SQL Alchemy in a more dynamic way. Basically, this one set of config files will be pretty much usable in any project. Then we have the migrate command, reset, and seed. But let's start with the init command first. So we can just run a Flask-DB init. And by default, that is going to create a couple of files for you. One, it's going to create an Alembic ini file, which is in the root of your project. And it's also going to create this DB folder with your Alembic configs and everything you're used to if you're using Alembic or Flask-Migrate. Now, I chose to put this in a DB folder, and let me go back to my directory structure here so you can take a look here. Notice how there's this DB folder here. By default, Alembic will actually create a migrations folder inside of your apps folder. So in this case, snake eyes/migrations is what you would get out of the box with Alembic. And there's nothing wrong with that directory structure, but I feel like having things like database seeds and migrations, it's not necessarily something that would belong to my actual application, right? So my thought process there is, let's put this thing into a DB folder that is separated from everything else. And by the way, if you don't like this and you actually want to do, your app/migrations, that's no problem at all. You can just run init -help here, and you can see what's available. So you can see you can actually just customize the path to where you want to initialize stuff to. So if you wanted to initialize it in like a migrations folder or something like that, then you can just do this. And we're going to get some different output here, which is actually, I wanted to show this anyways. But before we go into that, if I reload here and we go into Snake Eyes migrations, like there's the all familiar, Alembic stuff, just like now it's in DB as well. But, of course, I just showed the migrations one for the sake of the video. Typically, I use the DB one by default. But what's really neat about this one, because you might be wondering, like, ooh, is it dangerous to run like in an existing project that already has Alembic set up? Like, is it going to like start blowing up config files and things like that? So, I try to be very cautious with this stuff. So we can see here, this time we generated it a second time into this directory, but it detected that the alembic.ini file, which by the way is, it doesn't go into a specific like DB or migrations folder. It just gets dumped out to the root of your project. Instead of just like aborting or prompting you or erroring out, it just created a new one with a .new extension. So if you look here, there's actually two of them. So let's say you were upgrading from using Alembic or Flask-Migrate. It's just not going to like overwrite your existing file. It's going to create a new one. This way now you can open up your old Alembic.ini, go through there, copy any custom stuff that you might want. Then you can drop it into the new file, and then you can delete the old one and rename this to .ini, and then you'd be off to the races. And this kind of just like sums up what I just said there. I'm not going to bother like narrating it. But, again, like if you wanted to migrate from Flask-Migrate or Alembic directly, you'd also want to copy over things like your versions folder. You can just drop that into the versions folder here, and then you'd be completely fine. And then maybe you can diff these two files to see what's different and carry over any custom configuration that you might have, and you'd be done. That would be it. So for now, I'm going to actually delete this migrations folder because I don't want to have this thing installed twice. I'm also going to delete this new file here. And there we go, right? This is all set up and running. We don't need to actually edit any of these files if we don't want to. But now, since we ran the init, let's go back here and take a look here at some other commands that we could potentially run. So the next step here probably would be to maybe reset your database. So the reset command is going to, one, create a database of your choosing, and it's going to figure that out based on what you have configured for this, like basically your SQL Alchemy database URI. So mine all get populated by environment variables. So when I first spin up my containers, well, this is a side effect of Docker, but it's going to create a database for me automatically called Snake Eyes with a Snake Eyes user and a password of password. These are all defined in like an env file. But, if you're not using Docker, then you would need to explicitly create a new database. So this will take care of doing this as well. And if your database already exists, then it's not going to recreate it. So let me just rerun here. I'll do a Flask-DB reset. But there is a help menu here because there is one flag that you probably always do want to set. And wait, what did I mess up? Oh yeah, Flask-DB reset. There we go. So this one flag that we want to set most likely is like with a test database, because it's super important to separate out your test database from your development database, because you might be hacking away in your project, adding fake users or whatever data exists for your application. But then your test suite that you're going to be running like all the time, basically, that is going to completely reset your database in between every test run. So you don't want to like clobber your development data. You totally want to have a separate database created for your test database. So then you can just pass in this one flag here with test.db. And now this reset command is going to create both, in this case, a Snake Eyes database if it doesn't exist, as well as a Snake Eyes _ test database as well. And the reason why I just don't do this by default is because in production, you probably don't want a test database, right? You're just going to run like a Flask-DB reset. And when I try to design tools, I try to design them to be, using production defaults by default. And then you can override that stuff in development. So that's how that works. So now if I do something like a docker compose exec Postgres, you can run pSQL if you're not running Docker or whatever. That's where we're going at here. And I can just log in as Snake Eyes here, and then we should get a pSQL prompt. There we go. And if I do a DT in here, then notice how we have all sorts of good stuff. So this was after I ran a DB reset. So it went through my whole project and picked out all the models that are SQL Alchemy models, and it just added them to the database using the all familiar like DB create, which is functionality provided by SQL Alchemy, right? This was an empty database before, and now it is filled with all these things here. And also, if I do, let's say, I don't know, like a select email from users, then notice how we have nothing at all. And that's because no data has been seeded, because this tool is not going to know what to seed because it knows nothing about your application or, what's in your brain, right? In my application, it would be kind of handy, right, to be able to seed like an initial admin user. Like this is a build a SaaS app with Flask course. So it's like, expected that we have users and admin users and all sorts of stuff like that. So the one file that you will want to edit would be the seeds.py file, which is what's automatically created for you after you ran a DB init. So let's take a look here at this file. It kind of just gives you a very basic example here, with some comments like what you could possibly do. Like, all right, maybe like, let's just like import a user and then maybe find that user. If it doesn't exist, then like just go and make it. But again, there's no way for me to really know your exact imports and all this other stuff or what you want to do. So this is, an example that you're meant to just replace. So let me go ahead then and grab an example from off screen and paste it in here, because it's not important to like see me write this code because this is going to be very specific to your code. But and by the way, just a heads up here, in the seeds.py file, you do have access to the app context, so you can reach in and grab the current app. So in this case, all I'm doing here, I'm just importing my user model from, my app. It happens to be in Blueprint's user models. Then I just grab a reference here to the current app's config. And then I'm like, okay, cool. So on my user model, I have this one method called find by identity, where you can pass in an email address or a username to look a user up. And in this case, it's just reading in from the seed admin email, and I also have a seed admin password. Essentially how this works is, in my env file, you can supply these things through environment variables, and then that's how they get populated like securely, because you wouldn't want to like hard code like a seed password in here if you're committing this to version control. But anyways, that's a little bit of a side topic, but that is like a best practice. So anyways, I look up this user by email. If they don't exist, if we get nothing back, then let's go ahead and run .save on the user model. Now .save is just doing basically, a DB commit there, right? It's just like a convenience function I have in this project. But then, what are we doing? Well, we're passing in a couple of properties about that user, right? Let's make them an admin. Let's give them a default username of, admin or Nick Genetakis or whatever makes sense for your app. And then, we'll pop in that seed email and password from the configuration, which is being read in from environment variables. And now if I go back to over here, I can quit out this prompt here and clear this and then rerun the DB reset with test.db, or technically, if I don't want to reset it again, I can just explicitly run DB seed here. That's going to do the same thing. And if all works as planned, which we see here, like we didn't get any errors, then I'll rerun the pSQL here. And if I do a select email from users, we'll see here that we do have a user. And if I actually do, I can do a select star here just so we can see a little bit more. I knew that was going to look a little bit crazy with the zoomed font, so that's why I didn't want to output all the columns. But, our initial admin user is here ready to go. And now I can log into them, at the application level. Likewise, let's say, and the really nice thing about the DB reset, by the way, is that, let's say that you're hacking away in your application and you haven't deployed your app yet. So this is like a brand new app, kind of been working on it locally, maybe on your dev box for a couple of weeks or whatever. And, you decide that, okay, I'm going to add, some new property to my user, like something that didn't exist there before. It's super annoying, right? If you have to do like an Alembic revision and then create a migration for that and then migrate it and then blah, 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 blah. Like it's just a lot easier just to be able to run like, I'm just going to do a reset with test.db and then it's like, I'm done. So, you can locally make your changes very quickly just by running that command. And, if I were to rerun that pSQL command or whatever, it's all going to be in here as well. So I think I can just hit the up arrow a couple of times. Like, there's our user. And by the way, going back to the seeds file real quick before we move on to the migrate stuff, it's a really good idea to make your seeds idempotent. Meaning if you run the seed file one time or 100 times, the same result should happen. So in this case, you might be wondering like, well, why did I look up the user? Couldn't I just create them all the time? And I totally could do that. But then, if I try to save a second user, if one already exists, then things are going to blow up at the database level because I have a unique constraint or a unique index on things like the username and the email. So you definitely want to protect these things to only run when they actually have to, even if it means in this case, executing one more database query. It's a very easy lookup here. And keep in mind, like this is something you're only running once. You're only really going to seed your database when you initially create your application. You wouldn't necessarily be seeding it every single time you deploy your app. So that takes care of resetting and initting and also seeding. And yeah, so let's go into the migrate stuff. So when we ran that db init command, it does everything you would expect Alembic init to do, such as like this Alembic ini file is here. In this case, it just modifies the script location to be where all these files exist. So with Alembic out of the box by default, you don't need to really define this location because, it's by default will look for a migrations folder. But since we're using a custom path for that, then we do have this defined here. Everything else in this file is literally an exact replica of what you would get with in Alembic init. But as for the other things here, let's take a look. So, we have the seeds.py file, of course, very specific to this plugin or extension, but it has nothing to do with Alembic or migrations. I just happen to put it in the DB folder because it makes sense. Like, that's kind of where, in my opinion, this file should live. So then we have this, script.py like Mako file or Mako file, not really sure how to pronounce that one. This one also straight up from Alembic's config. I did not modify a single character here. That is all good to go. And then the env.py, there's a little bit of changes here, but they're not really like, oh my God, you're probably not going to want this. Like this is all good stuff. So what's interesting is inside of this env.py file, we don't have any access to current app. So there's just no app context. So what we need to do to get our configuration in, I would say like a dry way. Well, actually, let me rewind a bit because one big difference between the default Alembic configuration and this one is they have some other parameter defined here that you basically need to like hard code in your SQL Alchemy URI, like the connection string to your database, right? The host, the port, the username, the password, all that stuff. Definitely don't want to do that straight in an ini file that you're going to be committing to version control with database passwords and all this other stuff. Not that it really matters in development because you have like probably a weak password anyways, but still you don't want to have this stuff hard coded here because then like how do you change that in prod? Like it becomes like a total nightmare. So in this case, in the env.py file, what I do is I create an application and then we just read in our database URI from our config, right? Because we have access to it. And likewise, I can just sneak in here. This is like a pretty nice trick if you happen to be developing Flask extensions. You can just look into the extensions for SQL Alchemy or whatever to get the DB object. So, we don't even need custom imports for that because it's all available. And by the way, speaking of imports, like the tool will figure out like what the actual import needs to be for your create app. The import path will always be correct because it's based on the Flask_env to populate this, but the create app might be slightly different for your app. If you have your app factory function not named create app, then you will need to make a change there. That stuff's all documented in the README, but that's really the only thing you would need to explicitly maybe change. Now, what this does though, like it sets the SQL Alchemy basically config option based on that DB URI, so everything's all dynamic. Like this file, you're not gonna have to like edit it in between different projects. It should be good to go. So with SQL Alchemy or with Alembic, there's the concept of like offline and online migrations. Not gonna get into that in this video. That's way off topic. But know that this supports this as well because this is basically, it's Alembic, right, in the end. Now, it uses this config here to connect and everything is all good. And for online migrations, I typically never really use auto-generated migrations, but if you really go through Alembic's documentation, they have this one snippet that you can add here that basically says that, if nothing really changed and you have and you're invoking an auto-generated migration, then it's not going to bother creating an empty migration. And there's like a source to this one here if you want to check it out. So this little bit of extra code here and then referencing it down here is what's going in there. Beyond all this stuff, like this is all just straight from Alembic's config file. So there's really nothing new to go over there if you're familiar with Alembic. If you don't care about Alembic directly, then you don't even need to worry about that stuff. A lot of it is basically on like a need-to-know basis. So we initialized the project. We have it all set up. Everything is all configured and ready to go. Now let's say that maybe you deployed, you've been working on your app for a while. You deployed it to production. You ran your DB reset with the seed. Everything is going good. It's live in production. We're like, I don't know, weeks out. And now you have a lot of data in your database. And as you're hacking away on your code, now is when database migrations become a thing because you can't just do a DB reset because you're gonna lose all of your data. Like that would be horrible. So the way to handle that, and this is not like a limitation of this tool, like this is just how like manipulating databases are done. So you would go into whatever model that you want. Like let's say we're adding a new field, right? And maybe we should actually do this. So if I go to my user model here, then I have all sorts of different models on this, or different attributes on this user, right? Like username and subscriptions and credit cards and all this other stuff. So let me find the one for username, which is over here. I'm just going to bring it up here so it's a little bit easier for us to read. It's not mixed in with the other ones. And I don't know, let's say we want to just add a blah field. Like this is probably like the worst possible thing ever, but I'm just doing it to keep it very similar to a username, right? It's going to be a string and it's got a unique index on it. No, not really that important, right? So we have the new attribute defined in our model, but now we need to generate a migration so that our users table is going to be modified with this. So for that, we can run, instead of just doing a DB reset, we can do a DB migrate, and then we can do revision M and maybe something like add blah to users or whatever like that. And at this point, this is not like behavior that's super specific to this extension, right? What's really interesting here about this extension is notice this migrate command here. This migrate command is literally an alias to the Alembic CLI command. So you can just read this as like Alembic revision -m. And actually before you run that, let me really quickly just show you an example of this in an easier way so we can actually see that. So if I do web Flask-DB migrate -help, then notice it's going to give us the help menu for Alembic because it's literally an alias. That's it. So I just want to make that super clear. Like, there's no crazy code in this extension that tries to map out all of Alembic's like commands and arguments and options and all that. That's actually what Flask-Migrate does. And there's like, I don't know, 500 or 700 lines of code doing all of that. Mine, on the other hand, does not. It just forwards everything over in like 2 lines of code. Similar if you were using something like this in Bash, right, where you just forwarding all the arguments from one command to another. So anyways, not going to get into that yet, but I don't know, what did we say? Like add blah to users or whatever, right? So we're going to generate a migration file. This is like Alembic stuff, right? And here we can see it's been generated to that DB folder, using standard Alembic stuff. And whoops, if I bring up the sidebar here and I reload it, then inside this versions folder, there is our Alembic migration all ready to go for us. So right now in our upgrade path, it's not doing anything, right? It's just doing a pass. So we can actually just write, and by the way, we have this import up here. This actually happens by default with Alembic as well. So we can do an Alembic add column on, what do we want to do? Well, we want to add a column onto our users table because that's the actual name of the table. And then we can do SA here because we have this import from SQL Alchemy. And then we want to add a column of, what did we name this? Blah. And then it is going to be of type string. So there we go, 2 closing parentheses, and we'll remove the pass there. Not going to bother with the downgrade. You can always like remove the column. This is not like a tutorial on Alembic. I just want to show you how all this stuff is wired up. Now, normally, if you were running Alembic, then you would do something like an Alembic upgrade head. But if we take a look here at the help menu for DB migrate, then if you just run a Flask-DB migrate, that is going to automatically run upgrade head for you. So this is basically just a very minor convenience function, right? You can just run Flask-DB migrate, and that's going to run the upgrade head for you, which is going to make your database migration up to the latest revision. I find that to be pretty handy. If you really wanted to do upgrade head instead, you can also do that as well. Nothing's going to be done now because we just ran it, so we would expect no error, right? Like, it didn't apply anything because things didn't need to be applied because they were just previously. And, if you want to upgrade to something else besides the head, every option you can do with Alembic, you can do here as well. So let me find that one pSQL command that we had up here a little bit. There we go. And if I go to here and we do select, let's select, I don't know, something like email, and also the blah column, right, from users, then we should technically see our blah string column, which we didn't populate with any data, right? It's empty by default, but there it is. Like, we just successfully migrated our database. And that's pretty much everything about this plugin or extension, right? I don't want to narrate everything in the README file, but it's all here in the table of contents. If you get mixed up on maybe like what other commands are here, you can always just run a db-help and you can see them right here. And it kind of just goes over, what each command does, right? Seeding and best practices and resetting. And, if I scroll down here for a little bit, then, oh yeah, there is one interesting thing, I guess, to point out here. The reason why I did -h there for help, it will forward this to Alembic help, but we can't use migrate -- help. Well, we did before, and we noticed like, the help menus specifically for migrate, but this is from my extension's point of view. So I didn't find a way to like actually forward -- help to Alembic because -- help is a very specific thing to click, which is the command line tool that I'm using to build this Flask extension. But that's in this help menu as well. So basically, if you ever wanted to get Alembic's help, you can just use -h there to get that. Or honestly, for whatever reason, if you didn't even want to use like Flask-DB migrate, you can just run Alembic directly and it's all the same. So, I mean, it's an alias, so you're free to do whatever you want. I sort of like the alias here for DB migrate because one, I really like the idea of this convenient shortcut to have an upgrade head. And also I kind of like knowing that, when I run a Flask-DB, all of my DB stuff is in that namespace. So I can seed stuff, I can reset stuff, I can migrate stuff. I don't have to worry about like Alembic is actually the tool being used. And I don't know, I just find it to be very consistent. So, there's also a detailed fact here about Flask-Migrate. There's also another extension called Flask-Alembic, where if, maybe just using Alembic directly, like basically it's like why you might want to use Flask-DB. I'm not going to get into this because, this video is not just about like putting down other people's work. But just understand the implementation details of these tools are quite a bit different, and Flask-DB adds more to the table than just managing migrations because as you saw, you can do the reset and seeding as well. Maybe in the future, I will add other commands as well, but keep in mind, like this is not an extension that I just like invented for the heck of it. This is something I've been doing in my own Flask applications since about 2015. What I ended up usually doing was I just lugged around my own custom DB CLI command file that I would just copy paste between different projects. But I basically wanted to revise that a bit and make the seeds a bit more configurable, as well as customize some of the Alembic configs so I don't have to run like an Alembic init and then edit like 5 files or whatever. That got super annoying when you're working with a lot of Flask apps. And by the way, speaking about one last thing before we wrap this one up, when it comes to customizing the location of where you init stuff to, so in this case, I'm picking the default here, which is DB. So the seeds file, exists in this directory. And if you decide that you do want to use a custom directory, like if you really prefer a migrations folder inside of your application module, then you will need to customize the path to where the seeds file exists. So that is covered in the docs here, and it's very simple. It's just one config option that you would set, and it actually gives you an example. Actually, not only is there an example here in the help menu, but like let's say for whatever reasons that I don't know, like I'm just going to move this file to seeds2, so it doesn't exist. If I go back here and then I run a DB seed, then this tool tries to be pretty smart about it, right? It's going to be like, well, it can't find the seeds file. If you haven't done so already, you must initialize things because that's going to initialize where the seeds file is located. But then it's also saying like, if you're using a custom init path, like maybe you're using, my app/migrations, then you can just take this one config value here, Flask-DB seeds path, and then set it to be wherever you want your seeds file to exist. So even if you wanted to put the seeds file, I don't know, somewhere else, right? It doesn't even technically need to exist in whatever the init directory was. You can customize that, right? Just by going to your settings here, and then you would pop it in, customize it to be whatever you want, and then you would be good to go. But yeah, I think that covers basically everything here. There's always the README file to use as a reference. There's an upgrade guide to upgrade from Alembic directly or Flask-Migrate if you want, although we covered most of that on video. With that said, if you have any questions about all of this, feel free to leave any comments below. I'll do my best to answer all of them. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up because it does help in the end. Thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you in the next video.